Hello and welcome to Roundtable. Is there a danger that rising anger about how much it costs simply to live these days could become something bigger, more dangerous? Or by talking in these terms, are we encouraging that to happen? Protests in the Czech Republic earlier this month, many there wanting steps to curb energy costs and an end to sanctions against Russia over the conflict in Ukraine. Russia now saying it won't reopen the Nord Stream 1 gas pipeline it closed for supposed maintenance until those sanctions go. Prices will go up even further then. Will resentment grow? And if so, what would that mean? Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. A survey conducted across France, Germany, Poland and the United Kingdom appears to suggest that social unrest across the region is a real possibility as the current energy crisis bites citizens harder. This could well be a global issue, so we're traversing the world. First in Washington, D.C., we say hello to Mathieu Lefevre, Chief Exec of More in Common. We go to Singapore next, and Kaia Parv is their Chief Investment Officer at CrediLinq.Ai, and then to Birmingham, centre of the University, United Kingdom, Ellis Cashmore, Professor of Sociology at Aston University. Good to have you all with us. I mentioned at the top of the programme, Ellis, that perhaps we, the media and social media as well, are partly to blame for whipping things up. But would we be saying that this could be an issue if it wasn't?
I think we can sometimes, David. I think occasionally we anticipate so much that we almost wish these things into being. We panic people. I think we all, and I mean, not just the media that we're addressing at the moment, but everybody chattering in the streets and in the supermarkets. Will there be trouble? Will there be unrest? It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. In fact, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes that we panic people into doing stuff that they might ordinarily not do.
And the only way that can be reversed is if governments make sensible decisions that stop people from panicking. You seeing that?
Well, I'm not sure if it never can be reversed, actually. Once the genie's out of the bottle, it's out. I just don't think you can put it back. I think these things have a natural course.
OK, Mathieu, let me read some of the things that you put up when you did a survey in France. Those who were most worried: disillusioned activists, identitarians who feel their way of life is being threatened, stabilizers, optimistic pragmatists, the disengaged, the left behind. Who is more likely to see this, if not as an excuse, but as a reason for getting out on the streets and perhaps fomenting discontent?
Well, I think what's useful to note is the background on which this cost of living crisis is arriving. I mean, trust, particularly among these low trust groups, like the groups you mentioned, such as identitarians or the left behind in France, had been eroded by the COVID crisis. And now they're coming into this cost of living crisis, really feeling the pinch. It's interesting to note that we noted across our survey that about 1 in 10 people say they're already skipping meals because of rising prices, but it's 2 or 3 times more likely to happen among these disengaged low trust groups. So certainly, the risk of social unrest is going to be fueled by these groups who already arrived into this crisis with feelings of not being heard and not being listened to coming out of the COVID crisis. And this crisis of rising prices is just exacerbating that.
Is it a very dangerous recipe to have all these groups together? I know everybody is an individual, but if you get the disillusioned activists along with the disengaged that you've mentioned there, is that a recipe for disaster, unrest, or what?
Well, I think, overwhelmingly across the countries that we surveyed at the end of July, majorities everywhere think that this is going to be a tough winter, think that there's going to be strikes in the street and social unrest. It's interesting to note that in France, 4 out of 10 people we surveyed say that not only did they think the yellow vest movement was going to make a return, but they wanted the yellow vest movement to make a return. So certainly there is a recipe for social unrest there. I think the key to avoiding a crisis of social cohesion across Europe is going to be communications. Clear communications, particularly by government, about the reasons for the crisis, about short-term measures on things like reduction of VAT or price caps on energy, which are among the most popular policy solutions that we tested, as well as explaining the long-term plan. How are we going to get out of this? The why people are being asked to make sacrifices. I think that bit around communications is going to be key to whether this is the winter of discontent that many are fearing or not.
Kaia, I'm going to come to you in just a second. Once again, we're going to put up a graphic. I think this one comes from your group, Mathieu, along with YouGov, about the number of people you mentioned, strikes and social unrest. In France, it's 65% think there will be strikes because of what's happening, 63% in Poland, only just below half in Germany. Then the social unrest, Poland, 75%. Going down to the UK, 57%. Do you want to comment on the 75% in Poland figure, Kaia, or any particular? No, not Mathieu. I know you're about to say something, but I was going to throw this one Kaia's way. If she doesn't want to say it, then I'll come back to you. What do you think, Kaia?
I mean, Europe is definitely in a difficult situation. Not only is the war at their doorstep, but now with the gas being turned off and also oil price being relatively high. So I think social unrest, unfortunately, seems unavoidable at this point. And I know I probably sound like the most pessimistic in this group, but as my boss likes to say, I see the problem in every solution. So it just seems to me that it's a good mix of different things coming together, and we can't just discount the fact that there is a trend of right-wing socialist and I should say right-wing populist governments coming into power who fuel, in a way, that type of movement.
Okay, Ellis, I'm going to come back to you on this, whether you think what you're hearing from Kaia may well be fueling this as well. But Kaia, I want to ask you another follow-up to that one. Can you compare what we're seeing now with anything that we've seen in the last, let's say, 2 to 3 generations? And as a reporter in this country for very many years and elsewhere, I remember covering the riots in London, in Bristol, mostly about disenfranchisement. I remember the poll taxes, etc. So none of them came about necessarily because of the cost of living crisis.
Yeah, it always seems to be a mix of different things, and one of the crises I've been studying is obviously the one in 1930s, because that also emerged from a massive economic crisis. And I would say that the current crisis probably was planted after 2008 crisis, because certain groups were left behind. That's when the big wealth distribution started going towards that 1% or maybe top 10%, depends how you look at it. And I just feel that generation and certain groups feeling that maybe some parts are doing better than them. And now this has just been exacerbated by COVID crisis and also the cost of living crisis.
Ellis, I'm going to come to you for a response in a second, but first we're going to hear from the man in charge of Russia, who many blame for exacerbating the situation at the moment by making energy that much more expensive.
What comes around goes around like a boomerang. You asked me about the price cap on our energy commodities that some people are making decisions about. It's an absolutely dumb decision if somebody tries to implement it. This won't lead to anything good for those who take this decision. Besides everything else, there are contractual obligations, contract for supplying our commodities. Is someone going to make some kind of political decision that go against the contracts? We simply won't honour the contracts. We simply won't supply anything if it goes against our interests, economic in this case. We won't supply gas, oil, coal, heating oil, nothing. We will fulfill our contractual obligations in full, but if somebody tries to impose something on us, then, and I want to stress this, those who impose something on us are not in a position today to dictate their will to us. They need to think better.
So he's saying if Europe puts a price cap on it, Ellis, things will get worse, Russia will fight it. That is likely to appease people, but at the same time it could cause problems as well?
Certainly will, yeah. Let me go back to a couple of points that you made earlier, please, David, because like you, I can remember the riots in Bristol and Birmingham and Toxteth elsewhere, and the poll tax riots, of course. we should distinguish between the kind of unrest that we're talking about at the moment. There is rioting in the streets, almost chaotic, burning and looting type of unrest. There's also the more, shall we call it, organized unrest that we've seen recently. Extinction Rebellion, for example, and Occupy. This is bringing traffic to a halt and just making life generally inconvenient for people. A civil disobedience, you might call it. Now, in both those kind of cases, what is important is that there is a focus for the protest. It may be a narrow focus, as in, for example, if you want certain demands met by a government or a group in power, or it may be a more generic kind of protest. For example, in the United States, we've seen the Rodney King riots in the 1990s, and more recently, the protests against the police with the George Floyd uprisings. The focus in that case was racism and more broadly society generally. But where is the focus today? If we're talking about unrest across Europe, is there an identity for the object of the protest? Because I don't see it at the moment. I do feel that people are discontented, they're upset, they're fearful of what might happen over the coming months, and that's pervasive across Europe. But do they share a focus? Do they all know who to blame for this?
Well, this was going to be my point, wasn't it? Because back in the poll tax, they blamed Maggie Thatcher.
Exactly.
When it came to the riots in Liverpool and Birmingham, they blamed the fact that they weren't being listened to, etc., etc. But I don't think that people at the moment blame their governments because they know there are external factors at work here. Ellis, okay, Mathieu, you're nodding, but I'll come to you in just a second. Ellis.
Therein lies the point, David. They don't know who to blame. We now have a new government. We now have a new Prime Minister in the UK. And within 48 hours of her appointment, she's announced a whole package of measures. So people can't actually say, well, the government doesn't care. They're not doing anything about it. They may not agree with the proposals, but they know that the government is trying to do something to ameliorate their position.
Therefore, will protest groups be able to gain less sympathy than they might otherwise have done from, if you like, sort of disinterested members of the public?
If you ask me, if there will be unrest, I don't think so. Because of this lack of focus, I just don't think there is enough sharedness in who to blame. I mean, there is a more general feeling that it's somehow connected with Putin, particularly, and Russia in general. But, what's the point in rioting on the streets saying that Russia is the bad guys here? Nobody's going to listen, and Putin will sit back and think, well, that's quite nice, isn't it, really? It's kicking off in the UK and in France, in Northern Europe, all over Europe, and they're blaming me, and they can't do a thing about it.
Mathieu, saw you nodding. I'll come to you in just a moment, but Kaia, I want to ask you about the campaign group in the United Kingdom, getting perhaps a little more strident, called Don't Pay UK. We hear that maybe 100,000 people have said they won't be paying their gas and electricity bills in the coming months. We'll see how many actually do so. Is that the sort of thing that gains momentum, or do they tend to fizzle out?
I think it's a bit silly not to pay your bill, because eventually it will come to bite back and you will have to pay the bill anyway. But it's not completely unknown phenomenon. And this was something I've observed in my own home country in Estonia, where was similar movement happening, albeit at a very smaller scale, obviously. I don't think this is a genuine threat not to pay the bill in the greater scheme of things. However, I would say that I observe in Eastern Europe, at least, the civil unrest is much more towards the government, and I think it's in regard to government being integrated to the EU and NATO, who has perhaps done certain decisions to align perhaps and go against Russia. And even in Czech Republic, the riots we are seeing right now, or I should say civil unrest we are seeing right now, it's targeted against those Western unions. So NATO and EU are being the primary targets at this point, which is a bit bizarre because the Prague Spring was only 44 years ago, and seems history tends to repeat itself, at least that's to some point, and maybe there are some groups in Czech Republic that want to go towards Russia now.
What about the fact that there's another survey, it's called the Global Civil Unrest Index, that says that it's on the rise in more than 100 countries, but these are the ones with the biggest risk: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Germany, and Ukraine. Now, I don't know what any of those have got in common when it comes to civil unrest, but I was jolly surprised to see Switzerland in there, Kaia.
Same, and I saw the same survey. I'm not sure what the Swiss are going to be rioting about. I mean, it seems the quality of life is pretty good in Switzerland. I have no understanding how this survey was put together and what's the sort of common denominator for these.
Okay, we'll put it up there as an anomaly. Mathieu, let me come to you. What have you found out in conducting all of your surveys that has particularly surprised you?
Well, so what has particularly surprised me is how strong people's resolve around investing in renewables is, not as a sort of moral imperative to save the planet, but as a way to achieve energy independence. You could have thought that when offered options, people would have said, yeah, we should import oil and gas from other countries than Russia, or we should invest more in nuclear in places like France, where it's quite popular. But no, it's really investing in renewables that is seen both as a way to save money for the future, but also through a security lens and a sovereignty lens. That really did surprise me. I thought sort of adherence to renewables was going to be confined to sort of progressive segments or quite small groups. It's actually very large. But I did want to come back, if I may, to the point that was made earlier about who's to blame. What we found in our survey is that who's to blame is very clear across the countries that we survey. It's Russia. I mean, when we asked people who's to blame for this crisis, it's Russia that comes out on top. The only country where Russia wasn't on top is the UK, where energy companies were seen as more to blame. But so I think the point about, like, nobody's going to riot in the streets against Russia in Birmingham or the north of France. But I think the point to make is that could change. And the government could become the object of people's ires very quickly as temperatures drop, price increase. So
let's look at the UK. Let's look at the UK, if we may. New Prime Minister ruling out a windfall tax, a one-off tax on the energy companies. But in European countries, that appears to be something that's acceptable. Do you think, Ellis, that could turn things around in the country where we live, that the government will be blamed for not taking action when in European countries it perhaps is?
No, I don't think the government is going to take the blame here. I think there is plenty of goodwill for the government at the moment, unusual as that is for the UK. But I think the new Prime Minister is in her kind of honeymoon period, and people are prepared to see what she intends to do about this crisis. And obviously, she has 2 years left before the next general election, so she's going to do her damnedest to not make the crisis disappear, but at least to make it livable with. One of the things that we haven't discussed, and I'm interested whether Mathieu found this, is that whether the far right, as I understand it, is trying to exploit this position in some European countries where the far right has a strong presence. Now, the far right doesn't have much of a presence in the UK at the moment. But I know that some people are fearful that the far right will rise up and mobilize people on its side. I've heard this as a speculation. It is only conjecture. But
can I jump in there? Because this is something I was reading up about. And of course, there's going to be perhaps a new Italian Prime Minister fairly soon. She's regarded as right-wing from the Fratelli d'Italia, which had its original roots in the fascist movement. There's some irritation in quarters in Italy about support for Ukraine. That perhaps ties in with what Ellis is saying. Kaia, do you want to say something?
No, this is my observation as well. I mean, right-wing has been becoming more popular, and I can reflect again, let's say Hungary is a great example, Estonia is a great example, Italy is no exception. And I think the true test will come with Italy's elections, which could put a bit of pressure on the EU as a whole bloc as well.
But Kaia, if I may jump in here, the far right prospers when there is a scapegoat, when there is a group which is identifiable, visibly identifiable, and they can blame. and say they are the reason why we are in this distress at the moment. There isn't one here. I mean, as Mathieu said earlier, Russia, the consensus seems to be, are the bad guys here. But you can't in practice, even if you're on the far right, you can't in practice say, well, let's get rid of the Russians, or let's penalize the Russians. Let's do something about it. Because in practical terms, the far right has to say, well, we blame the Russians, but there's nothing we can do about it.
So
Well,
kicking
Italy has
kicking
gas
against an
from-
open door.
Far right will
Kaia,
not rise.
give me time. I want to go back to Mathieu.
Sure.
What are your thoughts?
So the short answer is, I think right now the far right isn't benefiting from this right now, but I think that could change very quickly. The one exception to watch is Marine Le Pen in France. She is seen in our survey as the most trusted. Her party is seen as the most trusted on cost of living stuff, and on
The most trusted of the right-wing parties, or the most trusted overall?
So the respondent said, "Do you trust any?" To our question, respondent said, we asked, "Do you trust anybody, any party, to deal with this crisis?" And the first response in every country was, "No, we don't trust anybody to deal with the crisis." But the first answer after that in France was Marine Le Pen. They said, "She is among the parties we do trust. She is the one we trust the most," and I think that could change quite a lot. And here again, actions by government. So the UK government's decision not to support the windfall tax, as you were suggesting, could quickly turn in favor of sort of anti-government parties, whether they're far right or otherwise, because people will say, well, wait a second, in our survey, backing windfall taxes is among the most popular policies. So people will say, well, wait a second, so they will find a scapegoat in the way that Ellis, you were suggesting.
Okay,
so
Mathieu, sorry, I'm interrupting because we only have 4 more minutes. I know you think Don't Pay, which we talked about a little bit earlier, could gain some more momentum. It is something to be concerned about.
I do think campaigns like Don't Pay will gain more momentum as they sort of feed off of this rising discontent as temperatures drop and prices rise. I think campaigns like that risk fracturing sort of national solidarity around the crisis. Right now, people are saying we're in this together, but campaigns like that and disobedient campaigns, I see their value, but they also risk fragmenting sort of national momentum. So I think while they have value, I personally think that they, demonizing others takes away from the "we're in this together" narrative, which
do we just muddle really through generally? Ellis, what do you think? We have a crisis in the 70s, late 70s in the UK. We have 2008. We have other problems as well. Most people basically say, look, it's not going to affect my daily life. I may be a little bit worse off, but I'm not going to get in any trouble. Let's just muddle through. We'll come out the other side.
Well, you're right. We habituate ourselves to the crisis, and as we do so, it becomes less and less of a crisis. At the end of the day, people will have less disposable income. I mean, that people will find a way to pay, and they will muddle through the winter. It won't be comfortable, of course, but and the poorest, the disempowered or the dispossessed, the people at the bottom of the pyramid, in other words, are going to be the ones who feel it most. But for the most part, those above the pyramid, they will just have less disposable income. They'll have to cancel their Netflix or perhaps go on a more modest holiday next year.
Okay, Kaia, final word to you, if I may. What do you think are the signs we should watch out for if this is going to get more dangerous for all of us and society as a whole, if there can be such a thing across so many disparate countries?
I think we should keep an eye. Again, I'm going to bring up Italy's election, for instance, which is going to be the party that's going to take power. Italy is a big moving block in the EU, for instance. They already have very high borrowing cost. If they start taking the direction towards Russia, because they are also the lowest on their gas supplies at this point, that could put Italy's exit from the EU back on the horizon, and that would be definitely a big secular move, I would say, when it comes to the stability of the EU.
Look for political unrest in Italy. Where else do you think there could be flashpoints, danger signs?
Eastern Bloc, I think, general Eastern Bloc, because they tend to be quite unhappy with the EU at this point, and quite a few countries would like to get their energy from Russia.
Listen, thank you very, very much indeed. A wide range of views reflecting the fact that there are a great many reasons why this has happened and a great many reasons why people are unhappy. Thank you ever so much indeed. Good to see you, Mathieu, Kaia. Ellis, nice to have you back on the programme again, and thank you for watching this wherever you happen to be picking up our edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, and the team for now, goodbye.